Hello, everybody, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Today, we are beginning Unit 3 in the AP US History curriculum, and this unit is one of my favorites. It's all about how America becomes a country and how we set up our government. So it's very important for the rest of the year. But the first topic that we need to learn about is an event called the 7 Years' War. Sometimes we hear it called the French and Indian War, and this is a war that's going to be a catalyst for the American Revolution. So if you're ready, let's begin. Before we get into the war, we got to go over a little bit of context for the war. One thing to know about European relations in the mid 18th century, mid 1700s, is that most wars are going to be fought over land. They're going to be fought over colonies. We learned in our last unit that there's this idea of mercantilism, and a lot of the European powers think there's a limited amount of wealth in the world, and they want to use colonies to gain more wealth, bring it back home. And so both France and Britain are fighting over North America and who can have more colonies. There's also the issue is that there's a lot of British colonists, and we talked about the 13 colonies, right, that are expanding west. But the problem with that is that there's already people that they're expanding to in the Ohio River Valley, and these are people like Native Americans and the French. Next issue is that most Native Americans at this time are going to side with the French and they're going to be nicer to the French. And this should make sense because the French are nicer to them. If we think back in our previous lessons about how the French did the Native Americans, right, they were much kinder to the Native Americans than the British were because the French were there for mostly trading, fur trading, that kind of idea. So this war gets started. There's also an issue with George Washington kind of challenging a French fort in Western Pennsylvania. That's kind of one of like the catalysts for this war. The last piece to understand before we get into the war and the results is that Britain is going to have this idea of salutary neglect. We've already talked about this, so think in your head. Do you remember what's salutary neglect? Right. This is when Britain is going to leave the colonies alone as long as they're profitable. So Britain's going to let the colonies do what they need to do as long as they're money. This is what Britain's going into the war treating the colonies like. And we'll see how this changes throughout the war. Okay, let's talk about the war and its results. So this is the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. It lasts from 1754 to 1763. No, not 7 years. Whoever came up with the name of the war, I don't know. The two sides of this: British with some of the Native Americans versus the French and other Native Americans. Also important to remember that the colonists are on the side of the British and most of the Native Americans are on the side of the French. But how does this war end? Well, Britain is going to defeat the French. And the way they're able to do that is they bring a lot of soldiers over from Britain, but they also force some of the colonists to enlist in the army, and they force some of the colonists to provide food and shelter for the soldiers, which is going to bother a lot of the colonists. And that's an idea to keep in mind for later. So when the war ends, Britain and France come together and they sign a peace treaty called the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This will be the first Treaty of Paris you'll hear about in this class. There'll be other ones, but this is the one that ends the 7 Years' War. The main result for Britain at this moment is that they're going to gain land. They're going to gain a bunch of French land east of the Mississippi River, except for New Orleans, because France is going to give New Orleans up and land west of the Mississippi to the Spanish. So we get Britain winning the war, gaining some land. What are the overall main impacts of the war? The most important thing we need to know is that Britain is in major, big time, super debt from the war. This war, we talk about it in terms of North America, but it's also going on in Europe, and war is expensive. Think about how much money it is for Britain to have to send over soldiers all the way to North America to fight this war, and they're fighting these wars in all these different places. It costs a lot of money. So Britain is going to be in major debt. And they have an idea for how they're going to solve that problem. What they're going to do is they're going to end that practice of salutary neglect, which is where they're leaving the colonies alone. They're not going to do that anymore. They're going to try to raise taxes, raise revenue from the colonies, and consolidate control. So Britain is going to say, well, look, we fought this war for you, colonies, so now you need to pay some of it back. And that's going to get us into some major issues that relate to the American Revolution. So it's really important to understand the impact of this war, the debt that Britain gets into, and how it's going to help create the American Revolution and some of the issues that we have in the colonies. Some other things to think about toward in the middle of this war and towards the end of the war that don't really relate with the French and Indian War exactly is a couple of these other ideas. So there is some conflict that we see with Native Americans as a result of this. One of these conflicts is called Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, this is a Native American rebellion in the Ohio River Valley that they're trying to resist British encroachment onto Native American land. Now, as a result of this rebellion, Britain is going to issue this next thing called the Proclamation Line of 1763. So Britain is actually, and I think this is a little bit contrary to what people might think, Britain actually decides, look, we're going to put a line on the map, and colonists are not allowed to expand west of that line. We're going to try to contain our colonies. Why are they doing this? Well, they don't want to have battles and fights with the Native Americans. They want to avoid this conflict. But this is going to anger the colonists. The colonists are thinking like, look, we deserve this land. We're dealing with Native Americans. You're all the way over in Britain. We think that we should have this land. And a lot of colonists are just going to straight up ignore the order. And so there's going to be tension between the colonists and Britain, between the colonists and Native Americans. It's going to create some issues. So at the bottom is this acronym that I've heard from other teachers who teach AP US history. And it kind of helps you remember how these things all relate together, some of these things that we talked about and why they're important. So it's called PEEP, Pontiac's Rebellion, End of the 7 Years' War, End of Salutary Neglect, and the Proclamation of 1763. And so if you think about these things together, it's kind of like a cause-effect relationship. We see Pontiac's Rebellion relating to the Proclamation of 1763 with our two P's, and then we see with our two E's, the end of the 7 Years' War causing the end of salutary neglect. And it's just a little acronym, a good way for you to remember how these things relate together and how rebellions and conflicts are going to cause some changes in the colonies, which are going to upset the colonists and going to cause a little bit of tension. That is it for the 7 Years' War. But I want you to think about big ideas here. So what is most important from what we just talked about? I tried to break it down for you in 3 questions. So take a moment, put these in your notes. This is a good way to summarize what you just learned. So what are the causes of the French and Indian War? 2, what's the major impact of the French and Indian War? And 3, what is PEEP? Why does it matter? So that's it for our notes today on the 7 Years' War. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.